Today was a real trip down memory lane because I started my career in telecommunications before most people in the room were born, and I hadn't thought about the CRTC, frankly, for a number of years. I was part of was on the board of the Canadian Business Telecommunications Alliance, which brought long distance competition to Canada shortly after they fought to allow you to buy your own phone and plug it into the network. And so I guess if I were to be optimistic, I would have to say that we've certainly come a long way in the last, how many decades is that? Probably five. At the same time, I think we are living um, in an age that none of us anticipated seeing, which reminds me of some kind of Margaret Atwood science fiction uh, novel, to tell you the truth. But what I wanted to do today, and I'm really grateful to um, share the stage with so many well uh, experienced and knowledgeable people. It's been very, very interesting. But I wanted to talk a little bit about innovation and where I think we're going with respect to inclusion and digital divide. And I can't really talk about issues around inclusion without acknowledging that there's been enormous backlash. We're seeing a lot of it spill over the border against issues around related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And all I will say is that uh, I work in a business school, and our orientation to EDI has always been grounded in the business case. Um, all workforce growth in this country is going to come through immigration. There was that very funny, I say funny in a not an amusing way, but in a sort of paradoxical way, debate about immigration. Too many immigrants, too many immigrants. Immigrants are driving up the housing crisis. Immigrants are the cause of all that ails us. And so the government moved very quickly to cut immigration levels. And then suddenly businesses, particularly SMEs, are saying, wait, where are all the people who are going to do the work? Um, we don't have enough workers. We don't have talent. And so when we look at the business case for equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's partly driven by the fact that the boomers like me are dying or retiring. I'm hoping to do the second before the first, but some days it's not clear I will. Um, and we know that we need immigration to drive growth in this country. Whether the level should be here or there is another point. We know that the population is changing. We know that women now account for the majority of university graduates, and we make 70% of the purchasing decisions in this country. And we know Indigenous youth are one of the fastest growing segments of the population, and so on and so on. And so, organizations that are not thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion as part of their business strategies, whether it has to do with attracting and retaining the best and the brightest, or developing products and services, or and developing products and services that actually work. Because many of you would know that we've seen a lot of recent research showing, for instance, that automobile safety systems um, kill women because they were designed based on male crash test dummies. Some of you may be old enough to remember the first voice recognition systems that didn't recognize women's voices, or some of the sensor technologies that only recognized white skin, and so on and so on and so on. And we can go through the arguments around how products have to be designed for customers. It isn't wokeness, it isn't political correctness, it's marketing 101. We also know that we live in a country where, at least now, the legislative frameworks including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the employment equity legislation, et cetera, really embed commitments around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And organizations that ignore those obligations really do so at their peril. There are real risks, not just financial and legal risks, but reputational risks. And we know that organizations that do a better job with EDI also tend to be able to retain more diverse workforces, and happier workers are more productive, and so on and so forth. So I don't think the arguments around the business case for equity, diversity, and inclusion have really changed. I think we just have to be a little more willing to uh, to pave our own path in the face of some of the changes in the states. And certainly there are some big issues for multinationals that are trying to do business there and here. But I wanted just to start by saying the Diversity Institute is firmly grounded in the business school and the business case for diversity. So I wanted to start by talking about the issues of innovation. And I realized today I worked with Don Tapscott on his 1996 book called The Digital Economy, Promise or Peril. And it's really interesting to me that we're having discussions about AI today, and it's very much framed in the same way. There is promise, there is also peril. And so we have to think about responsible AI, we have to think about innovation processes within a framework with guardrails and so on. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But really, what I wanted to center in our discussion is that I would argue that you hear a lot about Canada is not as innovative as the United States. You know, we have a Nobel Prize winner in AI, and yet we are laggards when it comes to the adoption of AI. And one of the things that I think accounts for some of the challenges we have, for those of you especially who work in tech companies, is there's a lot of focus on the creation of new technologies, right, and inventions. And whether we're talking about a vaccination or an AI application, those are inventions. The innovation comes when the vaccine is in my arm and I am inoculated. That's the innovation, right? Having a vaccine doesn't do anything for anybody if it's not being used and used responsibly. And I would make the same argument about Canada's leadership in AI. There's been a lot of focus on developing really powerful tools and interesting frameworks, but we are laggards when it comes to using the technology. And I would argue it's because often we frame innovation purely in the context of creating stuff, and we do not pay enough attention to adoption. Okay. And I know that it got a bad rap and there were a number of issues with the implementation, but the idea, the concept of the Canadian Digital Adoption Programs, for example, the concept, the goals and objectives, in my view, were very important. It was just the execution wasn't as good as it should have been. And people have been talking about innovation in agriculture, and it's one of my favorite sectors. I'm very interested as well in things like infrastructure, the sectors that actually make things, because as I said recently, you know, we can work in a virtual world, we can play in a virtual world, but we have to actually live in houses and eat physical food until, you know, replicators take root. And so thinking about how technology and innovation can actually drive change in some of those core sectors, for me is a very interesting thing. And that's about adoption, right? There's more use of technology outside of the ICT sector than within it. And we have to think more broadly about innovation as not just the creation of technology, but the use of technology. Not just the use of technology, but the development of new processes, marketing changes, and so on. So one of our fundamental problems, I think, in Canada has to do with the fact that we are preoccupied with creating technology and we don't pay enough attention to using it. That has unintended consequences because the obsession with creating technology as opposed to using it means that we tend to focus on science, technology, engineering, and math as core disciplines. And don't get me wrong, I started my career, or early in my career, um, 33 years ago, working on issues around women in technology, women in engineering, and so on. And I'm absolutely committed to those ideas. At the same time, when we think about AI, we think about the challenges around AI. Of course, we need people with PhDs in machine learning, but we need smart people who can talk about policy and regulation and consumer behavior and organizational change and use cases and. And typically, those people are not STEM grads, right? Why is that important? Well, it's important, A, because in my mind, it's part of the reason we're not getting the results that we want. But it's also important because when you equate innovation with STEM, when you equate entrepreneurs with Silicon Valley, this is what you get. You know, this is what you get. So it's critically important, in my view, to recognize how some of these fundamental assumptions create barriers uh, to entrepreneurs, barriers to people who could be making real contributions to ensure that we have responsible adoption of technologies. And it's interesting because there's been a bit of debate, not debate, but discussion today about how there's a bit of a tension in terms of whether we pursue kind of European models of technology regulation, et cetera, versus US models. The same thing is true when it comes to innovation, because in the European Union, there's a much more integrated notion of innovation. The idea that innovation applies not just to um, finding ways to make more money and grow, but finding ways to advance net zero, to advance social equality, to provide health care for all, and to promote the sustainable development goals. And I would say that that's the second thing that in Canada we have um, perhaps not explored as fully as we need to, because you see a lot of lip service paid to commitments around the sustainable development goals, whether it's ending poverty, net zero, they're all there in a kind of wavy, psychedelic form, I'd say. Um, but we tend to be very siloed when it comes to thinking about innovation or it comes to thinking about entrepreneurship, when it comes to evaluating the impacts of investments. And I find it very interesting because, um, and again, it's to me, it's not one or the other. But I did some work recently. I'm not an economist, but I know economists. And I did some work recently with really well-known economist at the University of Toronto named Morley Gunderson. And I said, Morley, I know Jim Stanford well enough. I grew up in a GM town. The Canadian Auto Workers did a really good job of making the argument that if you lose one auto sector job, it has a multiplier effect and you'll lose 6 more. And I said, can you make the same argument about entrepreneurs? Because Canada is a country of small business. 90% of private sector employment in Canada is small businesses. US, it's only about 50%. It's kind of ironic because the US has the kind of entrepreneur national myth, but in fact, Canada has more entrepreneurs than they do in the US. And the fact is, government makes assumptions that if you invest in electric vehicles plants or you backstop auto jobs or you throw money at a new startup in quantum computing, it will produce results. And it may, but they're often high risk investments. And we don't apply the same rationale to investing in small business. So that's the third thing that I wanted to focus on. And what's interesting is we actually worked with some of you may know Corrales. It was formerly CEO. And what was interesting about this is I remember one day Doug Ford announced $5 million for women and racialized entrepreneurs in the province of Ontario. $5 million. Same day they announced $17 million for the Perimeter Institute in Theoretical Physics. And you will see that happen a lot where there are big, big, big price tags associated with economic investments in manufacturers or tech companies. I'm not saying those bets aren't worthwhile, but we don't see the same level of commitment to small medium enterprise, whether we're talking about economic development generally, whether we're talking about transition to net zero, whether we're talking about adoption of AI. And we did a little study with Corrales, which is focused on women entrepreneurs. They basically crowdsource funding with no return and invest in women-led businesses. What was interesting is their $5 million investment had a 92% repayment rate, which meant that it cost about $800,000-ish, right? And they created 1,000 jobs through small businesses. And every single one of those small businesses also addressed at least one, typically more, of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm not saying that this is the only thing that we should be concerned about as Canadians. All I'm saying is I think there's a distortion in how we think about economic development and innovation. And we have what I would call a skewed approach. And, I'm not alone in saying this because increasingly we are seeing, especially in Europe, more focus on not just how much money are you making, how much foreign investment are you attracting, how many jobs are you creating, but also what is your impact in terms of other uh, social and environmental goals. And so I made this point previously, which I think is, bears repeating. Most private sector employment in Canada is with small, medium enterprise. And yet a lot of the policy decisions that are made, a lot of the business roundtables that we hear cited about economic development, innovation, and so on, are dominated by large corporations, which account for a relatively small percentage of the economy. So when we start to think about this, also with an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens, we also have to recognize that a significant proportion of small, medium enterprises are owned by women, racialized people, newcomers, immigrants, persons with disabilities, and so on. And that has to be part of our reasoning. And in fact, it's interesting. This is quite an old slide. So the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy was launched in, I think, 2017, at which time 15.6% of small medium enterprises in Canada were owned by women. Now it's over 20. It's a fairly significant bump, and um, it's a fairly significant contribution. The other thing we have to recognize is that not all SMEs are created equally, and not all of them face the same issues. And this was a study that was done that compared respondents from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business with members of the Black Business Professional Association during COVID. And the bottom line is basically Black Black-owned businesses were twice as hard hit by COVID, partly because of the sectors they were in, and half as likely to be able to access funding, because a lot of the models for COVID relief were designed on with a particular kind of business in mind. And we can extend this. For instance, a lot of programs, whether we're talking about COVID relief or we're talking about innovation or we're talking even about technology adoption, often the requirement is it be an incorporated small medium enterprise with employees. And for some people, that's like, yeah, of course, why not? What's interesting is if you use that definition, 20% of SMEs are majority owned by women. Sizable. Women account for more than 40% of self-employed Canadians. There are about 110,000 SMEs owned by women. There are more than 1 million women who are self-employed in this country. And so if you have a broader definition of what an entrepreneur is, suddenly more women appear. This is especially important if you're looking at Indigenous entrepreneurs, because half of them live on reserve, and they're actually disincentives to incorporating a business if you're on reserve. So if the criteria for access to funding for research or technology adoption is that you have to be incorporated, you're excluding half of the Indigenous entrepreneurs in the country. And a lot of them have limited, what are they called? Limited partnership models. They have completely different ownership models. So these are things that we really have to grapple with when we're thinking about innovation, and when we're thinking about technology adoption, um, when we're thinking about R&D, when we're thinking about hiring. It's also important to recognize that large corporations can afford to invest $1 billion in upskilling and reskilling, or a ton of money in technologies that they think will pay off later on. Many SMEs, especially post-COVID, are hanging on with their fingernails. I always think of Brian Tobin's turban, hanging on with their fingernails. They don't have the funds, the resources, the expertise to invest in driving forward, and yet they are the foundation of our economy. I'm at an age where I can either see you or I can see my notes. So when we think about the digital divide, I think it's critically important to move beyond just thinking rural urban. And I know people have talked about other dimensions of the digital divide, but for a very long time, and Catherine Middleton, my colleague from Toronto Metropolitan University, knows way more about this stuff than I do. But initially, when they talked about digital divide, it was about infrastructure, and infrastructure absolutely, absolutely, absolutely critical. And I'll show you some of the data on that. But it's not just about infrastructure. It's also about affordability. It's about devices, and it's about skills. And when we look at issues around digital divide, we also have to think about representation. of different segments of the population in the ICT sector. And of course, it's no surprise that women and Indigenous peoples, for example, are clearly underrepresented. Um, Lots has been said about the urban rural split. One of the things I really wanted to draw some attention to is the fact that not only does this have an impact in a general sense, and as was mentioned, um, COVID dramatically accelerated digitization, and I worked on telehealth projects in the 80s. I worked on telework projects in the 80s. I've worked on teleeducation projects since the 80s, and I still have a CompuServe account. So I've been doing this stuff for a really long time. And the issues around urban rural are absolutely something we have to pay attention to because it's almost a situation where rich get richer. The people who have less access to educational opportunities and healthcare, despite the amazing potential of the technology, also often don't have access to the infrastructure they need to access it. And this becomes acute, not just for access to healthcare and education, but also economic development and entrepreneurship. We just did a study last year with the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada looking at women, Indigenous entrepreneurs in the North working in tourism. Number one barrier they identified to growing their businesses. You know, some of these businesses are crafts or lodges or restaurants or tour companies. Number one barrier to growing their businesses was internet access. And so we may think about access to internet and how that impacts access to employment, access to healthcare, access to education, but it also affects the ability of entrepreneurs in smaller communities to thrive. As I said at the beginning, it's also critical from my point of view to recognize that the digital divide, I don't know why Frank thought this was going to be encouraging. It may be encouraging at the end, but or optimistic. But the digital divide is not just about geographic access to infrastructure, it's about affordability. We did another study with Environics during COVID. I think there were about 5,000 respondents or something. And what you can see is the ability to pay for internet, the ability to pay for cell phones, not surprisingly, we heard this earlier today, is very much a function of income. And so you can see that people with lower income are almost half of them are concerned about their ability to afford internet or cell phones. And this is more acute because of the intersection between um, different dimensions of diversity and inclusion and income. It's more acute for immigrants. It's way more acute for Indigenous peoples, and it's more acute for racialized people. But here's the kicker, because we know education is the principal pathway to social mobility in this country. We know, for example, that in the Black community, that the education divide is gone. So Black people are just as likely to have graduated from university as people who are not Black. They're not as likely to have well-paid jobs, however, and there are other issues we need to address. We look at the Indigenous community. Um, an Indigenous person with a university education has the same employment outcomes as a non-Indigenous person. The problem is only about Indigenous people have about half the university graduation rates of everybody else. So that focuses your attention somewhere else. But what the study that we did showed is that even in the city of Toronto, almost 40% of kids in racialized communities had to do their homework. This was during COVID when everything was going online, had to do their homework using public Wi-Fi or cell phones. So the access to internet, from my point of view, is not just theoretical in its importance, and it's not just a matter of urban, rural, and urban. It's a matter of fundamental access to employment, to education, and entrepreneurial opportunities. When we look at AI, in my view, we have an opportunity to use it for good or for evil. And we've, heard lots about that today. But we also have an opportunity to allow it to increase the disparity between the technology haves and the technology have-nots, or to reduce those gaps. And there are incredible opportunities. This is probably where I'm a little bit more optimistic, perhaps, is where I see some of the potential for, especially generative AI, and I'll explain more. I'll explain more later. But as I said, Canada's a leader in terms of AI um, inventions and research and Nobel Prize winners, but it is a laggard when it comes to adoption. And some of that has to do with the structure of the economy. Some of it has to do, frankly, with the fact that technology access is more challenging and expensive, and lots of people don't have the skills that are required. But right now, we're 29th among OECD countries in terms of AI adoption. We're doing lots of research on the kinds of jobs that are in demand. And what's interesting is they're not all the deep tech jobs. They're not all the deep tech jobs. A lot of them are jobs that can be undertaken by people who have lots of different training, not just STEM, and specialized courses. This is this is the study that we did recently with Environics that I think is interesting, alarming, and promising. So I'll start with the glass half full. What's promising is, despite the fact that formal adoption of AI in companies, when you do surveys of CEOs and so forth, formal adoption of AI by companies lags. Use of AI by employees does not. So what's promising here is a lot of Canadians are simply taking on upskilling without the support of their employers. That's good news. The bad news is employees are taking on upskilling in AI without the knowledge, support, or guardrails being put in place by their employers. And that creates massive, massive risk for the AI laggards. So the research, we have lots of stuff on urban rural differences and so on. And again, you can see that there's a digital divide in the respondents. And while there is a gap, and this is the thing that I think is super interesting and encouraging. So there is a gap between men and women. It's about 9 points. But what's important here is this gap between men and women reporting that they're using AI is much smaller than you would see with a lot of other technologies. Because generative AI is what I would call the English major's revenge, right? We had a lot of push. STEM will save us all. Coding, coding, coding. Start coding earlier. Play coding algorithms when the babies are in vitro so they pop out and can write algorithms. The fact is, Gen AI requires facility with language. When you think about prompt engineering, facility with language, logic, reasoning, and so on, does not require coding, coding, coding. And unlike a lot of other technology applications, this is encouraging. Also doesn't have the stigma or the negative associations of, pocket protector and whatever that a lot of other forms of technology do. So there is huge potential, in my view, for generative AI in particular to be a real bridger when it comes to the people who are normally not included in in uh, in tech. And um, I have not a lot of time, but I'll tell you one story. So I have one child, and she's going to inherit my money when I die. So I kind of sent her to do a master's degree at Parsons in New York City, which many of you know what that costs. It was a lot of money. And she was on the same visa as Melania Trump. It was for artists of unusual talent or something, which meant she basically couldn't work. Um, but I made her do a few courses here and there, including a program we run called the Advanced Digital and Professional Training Program. And there was a 1 week course in 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 basically intro to digital skills and analytics. And she went to the course. She cried every night. It's too hard. I say, shut up, kid, or I won't pay your rent. And she went back the next day. At the end of the program, she was the top pick of all the employers because what was key was the ability to tell stories, not to actually do the analytics, right? And now she's a what do they call them? AI ninja at Boston Consulting Group and tells everybody how to use AI. It's only a sample of one, but for me, it's a really interesting example of how people can take very different pathways into well-paid tech jobs now, partly enabled by some of the new low-code, no-code opportunities that are presented. So I wanted to I, d- I don't want to minimize the issues around the risks and the perils associated with AI, other than to say the biggest risk right now, as I see it, is is employees are using AI or exploring AI, particularly if they're younger, and a lot of their companies have not figured out how to put in the guardrails, the supports, and the use cases to manage that process. So it's very important that when we think about promoting the adoption of AI, we take into account the potential risks. So, bottom line for me is we have a real opportunity as a country to rethink approaches to innovation, to make them more inclusive, to think about when we define policies and processes, how we support entrepreneurs at every stage. Because women take different paths to entrepreneurship, and so do Indigenous peoples and many others. Where the traditional model is someone's discovers something in a lab and then they commercialize it and then they create a business. Often women start with a side hustle and then grow it into a business. So we have to think about making sure we're supporting businesses and entrepreneurs at all stages. We need to make sure they have a seat at the table when decisions are being made. We need to think about developing policies and programs with the diversity and inclusion lens. So we are addressing the needs of all Canadians, not just those with the loudest voices. We need to challenge the issues of bias in innovation. And, I gave you some pretty concrete examples of how if you don't bring an EDI lens to developing products and services, you'll basically create stuff that doesn't work. And we can search and replace on, you know, um, pharmaceuticals, safety systems, anything that has anything to do with humans needs to bring a gender and diversity lens to it, or it will likely fail. And we need to think about how we embed these processes at every stage in organizations. I don't really care what you call it. If you live in a world where you can't talk about EDI anymore, call it something else. Call it good business. call it market segmentation. And we need to really think about how to embed these things through the entire value chain. At the end of the day, and there's been a lot of talk about digital literacy, we developed this model a number of years ago in consultation with a whole bunch of people. And it applies, you can search and replace AI, green skills, whatever you want. Everybody needs a fundamental level of digital literacy, cybersecurity literacy, AI literacy. Everybody. Doesn't matter what your job is, everybody needs access. And, I worked a bit with Ladies Learning Code and then Canada Learns Code. And someone said, everybody should be engaged in lifting as they climb and helping educate other people. And I think that's absolutely true. We need a massive national project to increase the levels of literacy. We also need the people at the apex of the pyramid, the PhDs in machine learning and so on and so forth. But the biggest opportunity that I see in the market, and this is substantiated by lots of research, is that middle layer. I call those the hybrids. Those are the people who understand people, organization, systems, laws, policies, whatever, and enough about the technology to be able to ask the right questions in order to match technology with organizational needs, who understand enough about consumer behavior to understand what it will take, whether it's gamification or something else, to get people to actually implement what we know they should do with cybersecurity. And, one of the populations I didn't talk about because I could write an autobiography is older Canadians and what the implications of all of the digital stuff is for us. So that middle layer is a massive opportunity for people like my daughter who are not scared of technology and can actually create opportunities to match those to needs. And we have to think about meeting people where they are and providing the right wraparound supports in order to ensure their success. So, from my point of view, EDI is not something that is separate from our discussions of um, of digital transformation or innovation. It has to be absolutely embedded because Canada is a country of diverse people. And if we don't have strategies that meet the needs of everybody, we are not going to achieve what we could, both from an economic perspective as well as from a social perspective. And, I continue to argue that inclusive innovation is really something that is uniquely Canadian. It's something we value as Canadians. It's something that is part of our history, and it's something that will help us move forward in what is looking like difficult times. So thank you very much for your attention.